We're going to start this sermon this morning in the Birmingham jail. It's with Dr. King. It's 1963, and he's talking to his white jailers. We got down one day, he says, to talk about where they lived and how much they were earning. And when those brothers told me what they were earning, I said, now you know what? You ought to be marching with us. You're just as poor as Negroes. And I said, you are put in this position of supporting your oppressor because through prejudice and blindness, you fail to see that the same forces that oppress Negroes in American society oppress poor white people. And all you're living on is the satisfaction of your skin being white and the drum major instinct of thinking that you are somebody big because you are white and you're so poor you can't even send your children to school. You ought to be out there marching with every one of us every time we have a march. That's Dr. King. And today, if he spoke to those white jailers, he would probably hear worse. Just listen to J.D. Vance, author of the amazing book Hillbilly Elegy, which I urge you to read yesterday. It's so good. What many don't understand, he says, is how truly desperate the places of working class / poor whites are. And we're not talking about small enclaves or just a few towns. We are talking about multiple states where a significant chunk of the white working class struggles to get by. Heroin addiction is rampant. In my medium-sized Ohio county last year, deaths from drug addiction outnumbered deaths from natural causes. The average kid will live in multiple homes over the course of her life, experience a constant struggle, a constant cycle of growing close to a stepdad only to see him walk out on the family. She will know multiple drug users personally, maybe live in a foster home for a bit, or at least in the home of an unofficial foster, like an aunt or a grandparent. She will watch friends and family get arrested, and on and on. And on top of all of that is the economic struggle, from the factories shutting their doors to the main streets with nothing but cash for gold stores and pawn shops. No wonder working class whites are the most pessimistic group in America. More pessimistic than Latino immigrants and African Americans whose prospects are in some way far worse than that of the poor whites. Surveys show this, and analyses of health and mortality data from the CDC and from other sources help to explain. Death rates for middle-aged blacks and Hispanics continue to decline, as do death rates for younger and older people of all races and ethnic groups. Only the death rates of the poorly educated middle-aged whites are skyrocketing. One of the researchers actually said only HIV/AIDS in contemporary times has done anything like this. But despite this, nevertheless, we still see members of the white working class refusing offers that sound very much like Dr. King's back there in the Birmingham jail, to unite the forces of all the poor and the downtrodden, of all kinds, and so that they can fight the real power that shuts the door on their hopes. They refuse that. They support the oppressor instead. That's a fact, Dr. King says, that the poor white has been put into this position. Whether through blindness or prejudice, he is forced to support his oppressors. And the only thing he has going for him is the false feeling that he's superior because his skin is white. And he can hardly eat and make his ends meet week in and week out. Dr. King can say this because he knows his history. He knows that back in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, plantation owners in America realized they had a big problem on their hands. Before the slave trade, they brought over poor whites to do the work. By the time of the slave trade, poor whites outnumbered the rich landowners, and they also started to work with the slaves, to socialize with the slaves, to marry the slaves, and to even rebel with the slaves. Bacon's rebellion in 1676 being a prime example of this. Absolutely not tolerable for the rich, who also happened to write the laws of the land. And so law after law was passed, dictating that poor whites were to be treated with much greater dignity than slaves. Poor whites were also supposed to enforce those laws, to be the active agents of oppression on the ground. And a couple generations of this, and racism became the American way. But don't forget the classism that was the instigator of the racism. Now, what is classism? Well, it is despising folks who have the wrong kind of occupation, education, income, eating habits, accents, enjoyments, and all those other things that mark your position on the social totem pole. But not just this, classism is also about using these despised folks to serve the interests of the powerful. Poor whites, despised but useful. Which is why so much effort has been put into making them afraid. How did plantation owners convince millions of poor whites to fight the Civil War and defend a slave system that did not benefit them? How? Well, they pulled the strings of religion and politics so that a frightful image of freed, angry black men ravaging the South would dominate the public imagination and be impossible to ignore. As Georgia Commissioner Henry Benning proclaimed to the Virginia legislature on February 18th, 1861, war will break out everywhere like hidden fire from the earth. We will be overpowered, and our men will be compelled to wander like vagabonds all across the earth. And as for our women, the horrors of their state we cannot contemplate in imagination. Now fast forward almost 120 years, and it's Ronald Reagan. And he's trying to convince millions of poor whites to vote for him despite his Reaganomics, which proposed to slash federal aid programs so that the rich could receive massive tax cuts and become richer. How did he do that? He repeatedly trotted out the now infamous welfare queen story. It was devastatingly effective. In 1980, he became president. And as writer Jonna Ivan puts it, after a 2-year recession, the economy rebounded, it continued to grow, yet while the Reagan administration congratulated themselves on the economic expansion, poor people were still struggling. But Reagan had given poor whites someone to blame for their suffering: the welfare queen. He never said she was black. He didn't have to. And now fast forward to today. Now, what we are seeing is a particularly perverse twist to the hundreds of years of the racist plus classist American way, and how the white underclass is both despised and used. The Atlantic writer Connor Friedersdorf brings us straight into this. Imagine, he says, that you are a white man from a working class family who dropped out of college because you just couldn't swing the tuition. You worked construction, but that dried up. You're presently unemployed with child support payments piling up, a sister addicted to pain pills, your brother who is in jail again for felony drunk driving. Your beat-up car, that's what you drive, it's got a broken turn signal that you cannot afford to fix. You get pulled over regularly, and you're often harassed by the cops who who hate your tattoos, would you identify with a coalition that alighted on white privilege as the center of its cultural outlook and that mostly disseminated that worldview through people with more educational, social, and financial capital than you will ever have? Of course you wouldn't. To do so would seem at odds with all the struggling white people in your familial and social circles. It would seem to imply that failing, despite having all the advantages in the world, makes you a special kind of loser. It would seem to focus on race to the exclusion of other hugely important factors. And as far as you can tell, when a white family gets their door kicked down and their dog shot in a drug raid, or when a white high school classmate of yours commits suicide, well, no one in the world of the national media seems to care. Then you watch the DNC, where Michelle Obama, Cory Booker, Eva Longoria, and numerous other black and brown people who are much more successful than anyone you know, they take center stage. This needn't feel threatening in and of itself to cause alienation. All it takes is being told that you're the privileged one. That is Connor Friedersdorf. And what he is putting his finger on is good-intentioned transparency about something that is absolutely true, white privilege, which is another way of naming the satisfaction of your skin being white, which Dr. King talked about. But the discussion nevertheless generates rage. That's what happens when you feel relentlessly misunderstood and unseen by people who act like they know everything, but the one thing they seem utterly oblivious to is their obnoxious classism. Enter he who must not be named, who jabs at the oblivious elites and exploits the rage and enlists it to serve his purposes, which you better believe will be the rich getting richer. Now, how he does this has been unprecedented in modern politics. Unprecedented. We could go on and on about how unprecedented, but I will not. We will not, because it would be a red herring. We need to stay on target. The target is the racist plus classist story we have seen in America for the past 350 years, right up to and including the present moment. The white, poor, despised, but useful and used. And there's another way in which this is happening, and we need to get clear on it as well. We need to do this as a people committed to love and justice. That is why we are talking about this. Says the Jewish Talmud, do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. I know the work ahead feels impossibly complex. But increased understanding and rigorous honesty puts us on a better path. Let me ask you, who's actually supporting he who must not be named? Who do you think, when you can drive through some of the poorest regions in West Virginia or Ohio or Georgia, and Trump signs are the only ones in sight? Well, of course, we think it's the white working class. That's what's driving his campaign. Blame the hillbillies. Blame the crackers. Blame the rednecks. But now I want you to take a look at this fact. Gallup's Jonathan Rothwell determined that Trump's support correlates with higher, not lower, income, both among the population as a whole and among white people. Higher income than folks supporting Hillary. Popular impressions are just off target. Well, then who are the main Trump supporters? Well, they're more likely to be found in white enclaves, racially isolated zip codes where the amount of diversity is lower than in the surrounding areas. This also comes from Gallup's Jonathan Rothwell. Then there's UCLA's Michael Tesler, who found that support for Trump strongly correlates with racial resentment. Finally, political scientist Matthew McWilliams has discovered that a penchant for authoritarianism predicts Trump support. In other words, the main force behind the Trump candidacy is not poor. They don't know other people of color or immigrants or Muslims. Racial resentment burns within them, and they desire rule by authoritarianism versus the messy process of democratic politics. And then there's this curious fact. Trump does much better in polls conducted online versus in person-to-person landline or cell phone surveys. Now, writer Thomas Edsall says there's a social desirability dynamic in play here. People know that when they admit wanting to vote for he who must not be named in person, and thereby admit in person to a lot of other things, their social desirability takes a hit. Now, I go on at length about this because in the popular impression of poor whites being the main focus behind Trumpism, I see yet another instance of despising them, but also using them. They are being used as a smokescreen. Images of rednecks screaming at Trump rallies fill our TV screens, do they not? But do not blame them for the anti-political trends we have been seeing for the past 30 years, which David Brooks writes about so penetratingly in his article, The Governing Cancer of Our Times. People say, this is David Brooks, people say that Trump is an unconventional candidate and what he represents is a break from politics as usual. That is not true, he says. Trump is the culmination of the trends we have been seeing for the past 30 years. The desire for outsiders, the bashing style of rhetoric that makes conversation impossible, the decline of coherent political parties, the declining importance of policy, the tendency to fight out cultural battles and identity wars through political means. And the only thing I'd add to what David Brooks is saying here is that this trend is the brainchild of political elites. Who created American racism anyhow and wrote the rules? Who got us into the Civil War to begin with? Who conjured up the specter of the welfare queen? And the worst hurt are the poor, always the poor, including the poor whites, despised and used. This is why Dr. King said what he said in Birmingham jail back in 1963, talking to those white jailers. You ought to be marching with us, he said. You're just as poor as Negroes. He said, all you're living on is the satisfaction of your skin being white and the drum major instinct of thinking that you're somebody because you are white. And you're so poor you can't even send your kids to school. You ought to be out there marching with every one of us every time we're out there. Several years later, in 1968, Dr. King created the name for a campaign sponsoring marches just like that, the Poor People's Campaign. But 4 or so months later, he was assassinated by James Earl Ray, who could have been one of those jailers Dr. King reached out to. A man who lived on the satisfaction of his skin being white. A person who, being white and poor, was despised and used. And he murdered one of the best and brightest of us all. We have to stop fighting each other. It's like we're standing in a long line and we see people cutting in. And though we do not know the story behind each line cut, it instantly feels unfair, like something is being taken away from us. It seems like it will never be our turn, and in our rage, we fight each other. But the real question we need to start asking ourselves is, who created the situation that leads to lines in the first place? Who maintains the conditions of scarcity and fear? What are the forces of greed that enable corporations and billionaires to succeed while shutting the door in the faces of millions of others? We have to come together. We have to know each other, black and brown and white and yellow, rich and poor. The grief of this world is enormous. But do justice now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. We cannot possibly be obligated to complete the work, but start. Try. Opportunity does not knock. It presents itself when you beat down the door. So beat that door down.